November 23rd, 1944, 06:15 hours, Hürtgen Forest, German-Belgian border. Staff Sergeant William Hurley of the 4th Infantry Division's 20th Field Artillery Battalion stared at his watch as the second hand swept toward the 12. In precisely 45 seconds, something unprecedented in the history of warfare would occur. 12 separate artillery batteries, spread across 8 miles of broken terrain, would fire at different times so their shells would arrive simultaneously on a single German strongpoint designated Hill 401. The mathematics involved would have seemed impossible to artillery commanders just 5 years earlier. Batteries at different ranges, firing different caliber weapons with different muzzle velocities and flight times. Some shells would travel for 52 seconds, others for 38 seconds. The closest battery would fire last, the farthest would fire first. All calculated to deliver 216 shells in a single instant of coordinated devastation. Hurley's battery. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Positioned 4,800 yards from the target, would fire at exactly 0, 6, 15 and 17 seconds. Battery Baker, 7,200 yards away, had already fired at 0, 6, 14 and 51 seconds. Their 155mm shells were already arcing through the freezing November sky. Charlie Battery, only 3,100 yards from Hill 401, wouldn't fire for another 11 seconds. This was time on target, the most sophisticated artillery coordination technique ever developed, and it was about to demonstrate why American artillery had become the most feared weapon system on the Western Front. German soldiers who survived would describe it as supernatural, as if God himself had reached down and erased entire grid squares from existence. They never understood the mathematical precision that made such destruction possible. The evolution from individual guns firing at individual targets to massed batteries, delivering synchronized devastation represented more than technical advancement. It was a fundamental reconceptualization of artillery from a support weapon to the primary killing mechanism of modern warfare. By 1944, American artillery doctrine had evolved to the point where infantry existed primarily to force the enemy to concentrate so artillery could destroy them. The story begins not in 1944, but in 1918, in the mud of the Meuse-Argonne, where a young captain named Carlos Brewer watched American artillery fail catastrophically despite overwhelming numerical superiority. September 26, 1918, Montfaucon, France. Captain Brewer, serving with the 1st Army's artillery staff, witnessed the opening barrage of America's largest offensive of World War I. 3,800 guns fired for 3 hours, expending more ammunition than the entire Union Army had fired during the American Civil War. The effect should have been devastating. Instead, German machine gunners emerged from deep bunkers the moment the barrage lifted, slaughtering advancing American infantry. The problem wasn't firepower, it was coordination. Each battery fired independently, creating a rolling thunder that gave defenders warning and time to take cover. By the time shells from distant batteries arrived, enemies had already sheltered from the initial impacts. The sequential arrival of shells, what artillerymen called battery salvos in trail, meant that only the first shells had any chance of catching enemies exposed. Brewer documented in his after-action report, "Our fire, though intense, lacks the element of surprise after the initial salvo. The enemy has learned to recognize the pattern of our bombardments and take appropriate shelter. We must develop methods to deliver all fires simultaneously if we are to achieve decisive effect." This observation would germinate for 20 years before technology and doctrine aligned to make time on target possible. The interwar period saw the U.S. Army's Field Artillery School at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, become a laboratory for revolutionary thinking about fire support. Major Orlando Ward, who would later command the 1st Armored Division in North Africa, led development of new fire direction procedures in the 1930s. Ward recognized that effective artillery required 3 elements working in perfect harmony: accurate survey and registration, to know exactly where guns and targets were located, rapid communication to coordinate multiple batteries, and standardized procedures so every unit operated identically. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. Captain Harold Parker, a mathematics instructor at Fort Sill, had spent months studying the problem of simultaneous impact. Traditional artillery doctrine treated each battery as an independent unit. Parker proposed something radical, treating all artillery within range as a single weapon system. In 1935, Parker published Field Artillery Journal article titled Massed Fires Through Mathematical Control. He wrote, "If we know the exact location of every battery, the muzzle velocity of every gun, the weight and drag coefficient of every projectile, and can account for meteorological conditions, we can calculate backward from a desired impact time to determine when each battery must fire." The concept was elegant. The execution seemed impossible. It required computational capabilities that didn't exist in 1935. The solution came through systematic standardization. The Army developed graphical firing tables that converted complex ballistic equations into simple chart readings. Slide rules specifically designed for artillery calculations were issued to every battery. Most importantly, a new position was created, the Fire Direction Center officer, whose sole job was coordinating multiple batteries. By 1940, Fort Sill had developed preliminary time-on-target procedures, but they remained theoretical. It took 9 minutes to calculate a basic TOT mission for 3 batteries. In combat, 9 minutes meant the target had moved, dispersed, or dug in. December 7, 1941, changed everything. America's entry into World War II transformed time on target from an interesting theoretical concept to an urgent operational requirement. The first combat test came in North Africa, November 8, 1942. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa. Lieutenant Colonel William Crane commanded the 13th Field Artillery Brigade supporting the 1st Infantry Division's assault on Oran. His orders included authorization to test new fire control methods developed at Fort Sill. The French defenders, equipped with modern artillery and defending prepared positions, presented a perfect test case. At 0930 hours, November 9th, Crane ordered the first combat time-on-target mission in U.S. Army history. 3 batteries of 105mm howitzers engaged a French artillery position near La Seigne airfield. The results were mixed. 2 batteries achieved simultaneous impact. The third fired 14 seconds late due to communication delays. The French battery was neutralized but not destroyed. Crane's after-action report noted, "The concept is sound, but execution requires refinement. Communication delays and calculation errors degrade effectiveness." The Sicily campaign of July 1943 provided the next evolutionary step. Brigadier General Clift Andrus, artillery commander for the 1st Infantry Division, had spent the months since North Africa refining TOT procedures. He standardized communication protocols, requiring all batteries to synchronize watches every 4 hours. He created templates for common missions, reducing calculation time. Most importantly, he established redundant communication networks to prevent the delays that had plagued North African operations. On July 15, 1943, near Caltanissetta, Sicily, Andrus orchestrated a 12-battery TOT mission against German positions, blocking Highway 115. All 12 batteries achieved simultaneous impact within a 2-second window. The German position, held by elements of the Hermann Göring Division, was obliterated. Prisoners reported that the entire position seemed to explode at once, giving no warning or opportunity to take cover. The Sicily campaign proved that time on target could work under combat conditions, but the relatively open terrain and stable front lines had provided ideal circumstances. The real test would come in Italy, where mountainous terrain, poor communications, and rapid tactical changes challenged every aspect of artillery coordination. January 22, 1944, Anzio, Italy. The Allied amphibious landing behind German lines initially achieved complete surprise, but the failure to exploit inland allowed German forces to establish a solid defensive perimeter. The flat terrain around Anzio became an artillery duel reminiscent of World War I. Major General John Crane, commanding the VI Corps artillery, faced a dilemma. German observers on the high ground could see every American gun position. Any battery that fired immediately received counter-battery fire. The solution was time on target taken to its logical extreme. Instead of individual batteries firing and exposing themselves, every available gun would fire simultaneously, deliver devastating effect, then cease fire before German counter-battery could respond. February 16, 1944 became known as the Day of 1,000 Guns. Crane coordinated the largest TOT mission to date. 36 artillery battalions, over 400 tubes, engaged German assembly areas preparing for counterattack. The mission required 216 separate firing calculations, accounting for 23 different gun types, firing 11 different ammunition types at ranges varying from 3,000 to 24,000 yards. At exactly 1300 hours, every gun fired within a 4-second window. German units assembling for attack in the Campiglione area simply ceased to exist, an estimated 2,000 casualties in less than 60 seconds. German Commander Field Marshal Albert Kesselring later wrote, "The Americans had developed an artillery technique that negated every defensive measure. When every shell arrives simultaneously, no amount of discipline or fortification matters." The successful execution at Anzio required innovations that would become standard. Fire direction centers now used pre-computed tables for common targets. Communication shifted from voice to encoded teletype, reducing transmission errors. Most importantly, forward observers were trained to request TOT missions using standardized formats that minimized calculation time. But it was in Northwest Europe, after the Normandy invasion, that time on target would reach its deadliest perfection. June 6, 1944, Normandy, France. The Allied invasion included the largest artillery preparation in history, but initial TOT missions were limited by the confusion of amphibious assault. Ships, tanks, and field artillery had to establish communication networks while under fire. It wasn't until D+3 that American artillery could demonstrate what they had perfected in Italy. June 9, 1944, Carentan, France. The 101st Airborne Division needed to capture this critical road junction, but German Fallschirmjäger held strong defensive positions. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, artillery commander of the 101st, coordinated a TOT mission that would become a textbook example. 9 batteries positioned in a rough arc around Carentan calculated their firing times. The closest battery, just 2,100 yards from the target, would fire last. The most distant, 7,800 yards away, would fire first. Weather teams released balloons to measure wind speeds at different altitudes. Survey teams verified positions to within 3 feet. Communications personnel established primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency networks. At exactly 0500 hours, 81 shells detonated simultaneously over German positions defending the Carentan causeway. Survivors described it as the world ending. One moment, darkness and quiet. The next, the entire position erupting in fire and steel. The psychological effect exceeded the physical damage. German troops abandoned positions rather than face another such barrage. The liberation of France saw time on target evolve from a special technique to standard procedure. Every American division developed TOT capability. Fire direction centers could calculate missions in under 90 seconds. Forward observers called for TOT as casually as they requested any other fire mission. September 1944, Moselle River, France. The Third Army's crossing of the Moselle demonstrated TOT at its most sophisticated. General George Patton wanted to cross the river quickly before German forces could establish strong defenses. The problem was that any concentration of assault boats would immediately attract artillery fire. The solution came from Lieutenant Colonel Harold Mauldin, 3rd Army Artillery Operations Officer. Instead of traditional preparatory bombardment that would alert the Germans, he proposed using TOT to destroy German positions at the exact moment American troops reached the middle of the river, too late for defenders to react but early enough to suppress resistance. The mission required split-second timing. Assault boats would launch at H-4 minutes. At H-2, they would reach the middle of the river, fully exposed. At exactly hour, 18 battalions of artillery would execute TOT on German positions along the eastern bank. September 12th, 0600 hours. As the lead assault boats of the 5th Infantry Division reached midstream, the eastern bank erupted. 324 shells arrived simultaneously along a 2,000-yard front. German defenders, caught completely by surprise, were still in their bunkers when American infantry reached the shore. The crossing succeeded with minimal casualties. The technique spread throughout the European theatre. British forces, initially skeptical, observed American TOT missions and immediately began developing their own procedures. Soviet observers, while impressed by the devastation, dismissed it as too complicated for the Eastern Front's mobile operations. German forces, despite capturing American fire direction equipment and manuals, never successfully replicated TOT. The precise survey work, standardized procedures, and communications infrastructure required were beyond their degraded capabilities by late 1944, which brings us back to November 23, 1944, in the Hürtgen Forest, where Staff Sergeant Hurley's battery was about to demonstrate why American artillery had become the dominant force on the battlefield. The Hürtgen Forest represented the worst possible environment for artillery. Dense woods limited observation. Hills and valleys created dead spaces where fire couldn't reach. Wet conditions degraded propellant performance. Trees caused premature detonations. Yet American artillery, through time on target, had adapted even to this green hell. Hurley's target, Hill 401, housed German bunkers that had resisted 3 infantry assaults. Traditional artillery had failed to penetrate the overhead cover. The solution was TOT with mixed ammunition types. Some batteries would fire high explosive to strip away trees and expose bunkers. Others fire white phosphorus to create smoke and start fires. Delayed fuse shells would penetrate bunkers before detonating. 0616 hours. Hurley pulled the lanyard on his howitzer, adding his shell to the hundreds already converging on Hill 401. He couldn't see the target through the forest, but forward observer Lieutenant James Crawford could. Crawford's report, preserved in division records, captures the moment. At exactly 06:1640, the entire hilltop disappeared. It wasn't destroyed or damaged. It simply ceased to exist as a recognizable terrain feature. When the smoke cleared, nothing remained but crater overlapping crater. No bunkers, no trees, no resistance. The 28th Infantry Division took Hill 401 without firing a shot. German survivors found days later in deep bunkers were completely traumatized, unable to explain what had happened. They spoke of the forest exploding all at once, of bunkers collapsing simultaneously, of comrades vaporized without warning. The technical mastery required for such precision went beyond mere mathematics. Each participating battery had to account for 27 different variables that could affect shell flight. Barrel wear from previous firings altered muzzle velocity. Propellant temperature changed burn rates. Air density, which varied with altitude and humidity, affected drag. Wind speeds at different altitudes could push shells off course. Even the rotation of the Earth, the Coriolis effect, had to be calculated for long-range fires. Captain Robert McKinney, fire direction officer for the 10th Field Artillery Battalion, kept detailed notes of TOT calculations that survived in the National Archives. For the Hill 401 mission, his calculations show the complexity involved. Battery able, firing at 6,200 yards, needed to account for a crosswind of 12 miles per hour at 3,000 feet, barrel wear that had reduced muzzle velocity by 18 feet per second, and propellant temperature of 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 degrees below standard. The calculation: standard flight time would be 23.4 seconds. Corrections added 1.2 seconds for reduced velocity, subtracted 0.3 seconds for cold propellant increasing burn rate, added 0.8 seconds for headwind component. Final flight time, 25.1 seconds. Therefore, to achieve impact at 06:1640, battery able had to fire at 06:1615, Multiply this calculation by 12 batteries, each with different positions, barrel conditions, and local weather, and the achievement becomes clear. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. This wasn't just artillery, it was applied mathematics at a level that would challenge university professors, performed under combat conditions by men who months earlier had been farmers, factory workers, and store clerks. The German perspective on time on target reveals its psychological impact beyond physical destruction. Hauptmann Karl Decker, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 275th Infantry Division in the Hürtgen Forest, survived the war and provided detailed testimony to US Army historians. The normal artillery we could endure. You hear the first shells, you take cover, you wait for it to end. But this new technique, this simultaneous arrival, it was like the fist of God. No warning, no time to react. Men who had served since Poland, who had survived Stalingrad, were broken by it. They would desert rather than face it again. Decker's unit war diary, captured intact, documents the effect. November 24th entry. Enemy artillery employs new tactic. All shells arrive simultaneously. Casualties catastrophic. Morale failing. Request immediate withdrawal. Request denied. November 25th. Half the battalion has disappeared. Some killed, most deserted. Cannot hold position if enemy repeats yesterday's bombardment. December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. The German Wehrmacht launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, their last major offensive on the Western Front. 25 divisions smashed into thinly held American lines, achieving complete tactical surprise. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. For the first 48 hours, American forces reeled backward in confusion. Units were overrun, surrounded, or scattered. Communications failed. Command structures collapsed, but one element remained functional: artillery fire direction centers. Even as infantry fled, artillery batteries maintained position and communication. December 18th, 0900 hours, Rocherath-Krinkelt, Belgium. The 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions were compressed into a small salient, surrounded on three sides by elements of the 6th Panzer Army. German commanders, confident of victory, massed troops for a final assault to break through to Liège. Lieutenant Colonel Barclay Stone, artillery commander for the 2nd Division, recognized the opportunity. German forces, accustomed to attacking disorganized Americans, had concentrated in the open, violating their own doctrine about dispersion. Stone coordinated the most complex TOT mission yet attempted. 23 battalions of artillery, including corps and army assets, would engage simultaneously. The challenge was unprecedented. Batteries were scattered across 30 miles of front, some displaced by German attacks, others hastily positioned without proper survey. Communications ran through multiple headquarters, each adding potential delay. Some batteries had to calculate for maximum range, where small errors could miss entirely. At exactly 0945, over 400 shells converged on German assembly areas east of Rocherath. The concentration included every caliber from 75mm pack howitzers to 240mm super-heavy guns. Time-fused shells burst overhead while impact-fused shells erupted from the frozen ground. White phosphorus created walls of smoke and fire. High explosive turned the snow-covered fields into moonscapes. Untersturmführer Joachim Peiper, commanding Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army, witnessed the barrage from an observation post. His account, given during interrogation after capture: "I have seen Russian artillery on the Eastern Front, British artillery in Italy. Nothing compared to this. My battalion, 1,000 men, simply vanished. When the smoke cleared, I could count perhaps 100 still standing." The failed German assault at Rocherath-Krinkelt marked the high point of their offensive in the northern sector. Time on target had stopped the 6th Panzer Army cold. But the technique's true value emerged during the American counteroffensive. As German forces retreated through the narrow roads of the Ardennes, they presented perfect targets for TOD missions. Columns of vehicles, unable to disperse due to forest and terrain, could be engaged with devastating effect. January 3, 1945. Houffalize, Belgium. The German retreat had created a massive traffic jam as two panzer divisions tried to withdraw through a single road junction. American reconnaissance aircraft reported vehicles backed up for 3 miles. Brigadier General Williston Palmer, 3rd Army Artillery Commander, coordinated what participants would later call the greatest shoot. 32 battalions from 3 different corps participated. The target wasn't a point, but a line, the entire 3-mile column. Each battery was assigned a specific 300-yard section. The complexity required a new level of coordination. Batteries had to fire at different times, not just to achieve simultaneous impact, but to ensure their assigned sections were engaged in sequence, creating a rolling curtain of destruction that would prevent escape. At 1400 hours, 960 shells arrived along the column within an hour, 8-second window. The effect was apocalyptic. Vehicles exploded, ammunition detonated, fuel burned. The forest itself caught fire. When reconnaissance aircraft overflew the area the next day, they counted over 400 destroyed vehicles. The 2 panzer divisions had effectively ceased to exist. The Pacific Theater presented different challenges that required adaptation of time-on-target techniques. Island warfare meant shorter ranges but more difficult survey conditions. Jungle terrain blocked observation. Coral soil created different crater patterns than European Earth. Most significantly, Japanese tactics differed completely from German. February 19, 1945. Iwo Jima. Mount Suribachi loomed over the invasion beaches, its caves and bunkers immune to naval gunfire. The Japanese had learned from previous island battles. Instead of beach defences that could be destroyed by bombardment, they had created interlocking positions inland, designed to wait until Marines were fully committed before opening fire. Colonel John Letcher, commanding the 5th Marine Division Artillery, faced an impossible problem. Japanese positions were invisible until they fired. By then, Marines were dying in the open. Traditional counter-battery was too slow. By the time shells arrived, Japanese guns had withdrawn into caves. The solution came from adapting time on target to micro-terrain. Instead of grand barrages, Letcher organized what he called instant response TOT. Forward observers would identify a Japanese position, call for immediate TOT, and have shells arriving within 90 seconds. It required pre-calculating data for thousands of potential targets, creating a grid reference system accurate to 10 yards, and positioning batteries to cover overlapping sectors. The first test came February 22nd, when a Japanese 75mm gun revealed itself firing on Marines advancing toward Airfield No. 2. The forward observer, 1st Lieutenant John Keith, immediately called Flash Thunder 6, Grid 7, 3, 8, 4, 9, 5, TOT, fire for effect. 3 batteries had pre-calculated data for that grid. Within 15 seconds, they had loaded and fired. At 53 seconds, 18 shells converged on the Japanese position. The gun was destroyed, but more importantly, the crew had no time to withdraw. For the first time, American artillery could engage and destroy Japanese positions faster than they could shoot and retreat. The technique proved so effective that by battle's end, Marine artillery on Iwo Jima was achieving 1 confirmed Japanese position destroyed for every 38 rounds fired, compared to 1 for 300 rounds in conventional bombardment. The ultimate evolution of time on target came during the invasion of Okinawa, where the concentration of American artillery exceeded anything seen in the Pacific War. 4 Marine and 4 Army artillery regiments, plus Corps and Army assets, provided over 600 tubes on an island only 60 miles long. April 19, 1945, the assault on the Shuri Line, the main Japanese defensive position on Okinawa. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, commanding the 10th Army, ordered the largest TOD mission of the Pacific War. Target: the entire Shuri defensive complex, a maze of interconnected positions stretching 3 miles. The mission pushed time on target to its absolute limit. 72 battalions would participate, delivering over 3,000 shells simultaneously. Some batteries were 20 miles from their targets, requiring flight times exceeding 70 seconds. Weather teams tracked winds at 6 different altitudes. Survey teams worked through the night verifying positions. Fire direction centers divided the target into 144 subsectors, each assigned to specific batteries. The complexity required 3 levels of coordination. Battalion FDCs calculated individual battery data, division FDCs synchronized battalions, and Corps FDC orchestrated the entire mission. At 0600 hours, April 19th, the sky over southern Okinawa turned black with shells. Japanese Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, one of the few senior officers to survive, described it in his memoir. The Americans had made artillery into something beyond war. It was systematic annihilation. Every defensive position we had built over months was destroyed in seconds. Not minutes, seconds. The Shuri TOT killed an estimated 3,000 Japanese soldiers instantly. More importantly, it shattered the cohesion of the 32nd Army. Units lost contact, commanders died at their posts, communications vanished. What had been an organized defense became isolated groups fighting without coordination. Yet even this massive demonstration didn't represent the pinnacle of time on target. That would come in the planned invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, scheduled for November 1945. Planning documents, declassified decades later, reveal the artillery preparation for the invasion of Kyushu. 16,000 tubes would execute the largest TOT mission ever conceived. Every beach, every defensive position, every suspected strongpoint would be engaged simultaneously. The initial TOT would deliver 48,000 shells in the first 4 seconds. Colonel Michael Hayes, assigned to plan the artillery component, calculated that the opening TOT would expend more ammunition than the entire US Army had used in World War I. The logistics alone required 17 ammunition ships, 400 landing craft, and 32,000 personnel just to handle shells. The atomic bombs ended the war before Operation Downfall launched, but the planning revealed how completely time on target had transformed American thinking about artillery. It was no longer support for infantry. It was the primary weapon, with infantry serving to identify targets and occupy destroyed positions. The human cost of time on target extended beyond those killed by it. The technique required a new kind of soldier, one who could perform complex mathematics under fire, maintain precise communications despite chaos, and execute elaborate procedures while friends died around them. Sergeant First Class Thomas Murray, who served as a fire direction computer with the 34th Field Artillery Battalion from North Africa through Germany, reflected years later. People think artillery was easier than infantry because we were behind the lines. They don't understand the pressure. One miscalculation, and our shells land on our own men. One communication error, and the entire mission fails. We lived with slide rules and firing tables, checking and rechecking every number because lives depended on getting it exactly right. The psychological toll on those who directed such devastation was significant. Forward observers, who watched their calls for fire literally erase enemy positions, reported nightmares that persisted decades after the war. Captain David Stern, a forward observer with the 4th Infantry Division, wrote in his unpublished memoir, "I could call down the wrath of God with a radio transmission. Grid coordinates, and suddenly hundreds of men ceased to exist. The power was intoxicating and horrifying. I've never escaped the weight of it." The German and Japanese militaries never developed equivalent capabilities, though not for lack of trying. Captured German documents show they understood the concept, but lacked the organizational structure to execute it. Japanese doctrine emphasized individual battery action and never evolved the centralized fire control essential for time on target. This failure wasn't just technical but philosophical. Time on target required abandoning traditional artillery independence in favor of centralized control. It demanded standardization that conflicted with traditions of battery autonomy. Most fundamentally, it represented warfare as mathematical problem-solving rather than martial courage. Colonel Friedrich von Mellenthin, serving on the German General Staff, wrote after the war, "The Americans had made war into science. We were still fighting with the passion and skill of warriors. They were solving engineering problems. When warrior met engineer on the modern battlefield, the engineer always won." The influence of time on target extended far beyond World War II. Every modern military adopted similar techniques. Digital computers replaced slide rules and graphical tables, GPS replaced manual survey, encrypted data links replaced voice radio, but the fundamental concept, massing fires from multiple locations to achieve simultaneous impact, remained unchanged. In Korea, time on target devastated Chinese human wave attacks. At Chipyong-ni in February 1951, a single TOT mission by the 23rd Infantry Regiment's artillery destroyed an entire Chinese regiment, over 3,000 men, in less than 90 seconds. In Vietnam, TOT evolved into instant death, where forward observers could call for fires from every battery within range, sometimes achieving 20 battery TOT within 2 minutes of the initial call. Firebase Illingworth, attacked by the North Vietnamese Army on April 1, 1970, survived because artillery from 5 distant firebases delivered simultaneous concentrations that broke up massed assaults. The Gulf War in 1991 showcased digital TOT, where computers calculated firing solutions in microseconds and GPS-guided shells achieved accuracies impossible in World War II. During the Battle of 73 Easting, a single tow mission by the 210th Field Artillery Brigade destroyed an entire Iraqi Republican Guard battalion in 14 seconds. Modern conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan adapted TOT for counterinsurgency, where precision mattered more than volume. Instead of hundreds of shells, a few, precisely timed rounds could eliminate threats while minimizing collateral damage. The mathematics remained the same, but the application evolved with the nature of warfare. The legacy of time on target transcends military history. It represents a fundamental shift in how humans approach complex problems. The same mathematical principles that coordinated artillery in 1944 now synchronize satellite communications, coordinate air traffic control, and manage electrical power grids. Dr. Harold Spencer, who served as a fire direction officer in World War II before becoming a professor of applied mathematics at MIT, observed, "Time on target taught us that any complex system could be decomposed into manageable calculations. The skills we developed coordinating artillery became the foundation for operations research, systems analysis, and ultimately computer science." The 75,000 American artillery personnel who mastered time on target during World War II didn't just win battles. They demonstrated that disciplined application of mathematics could overcome any tactical problem. Their legacy lives on in every synchronized system that makes modern life possible. Standing in the Hürtgen Forest today, it's difficult to imagine the hell that Staff Sergeant Hurley and his fellow artillerymen created on November 23, 1944. The trees have regrown, hiding scars in the earth. Hill 401 looks like any other forested slope, but beneath the peaceful surface, metal detectors still find shell fragments, evidence of the moment when American artillery achieved perfect synchronization. The German soldiers who died that morning never knew what killed them. They heard no warning, had no chance to take cover, no opportunity to fight back. They were simply erased by mathematics made manifest in high explosive and steel. It was not glorious. It was not honorable by traditional standards of warfare. It was simply effective beyond anything previous generations of soldiers could have imagined. Time on target represented the ultimate expression of American military philosophy in World War II, the application of industrial methods and scientific thinking to the ancient problem of destroying enemies. While German and Japanese forces celebrated warrior spirit and individual courage, Americans built systems that made courage irrelevant. While enemies relied on experience and intuition, Americans reduced warfare to calculations anyone could perform with proper training. The 12 batteries that fired on Hill 401 that November morning didn't just destroy a German strongpoint. They demonstrated that modern war belonged to those who could best organize and synchronize complex systems. The age of the warrior had ended. the age of the technician had begun. In the end, time on target stands as perhaps the purest expression of how World War II was won. Not through superior courage, though American soldiers showed plenty. Not through better tactics, though American doctrine proved sound, but through the patient, systematic application of mathematical principles to the brutal realities of modern combat. Those 28 Infantry Division soldiers who walked up Hill 401 after the barrage found no heroic last stands, no desperate hand-to-hand combat, no glory, just cratered earth and silence. The artillery had done its work with terrible efficiency. The mathematics had been perfect, the synchronization flawless. The enemy had simply ceased to exist. This was the reality of time on target. Not the thunder of guns or the courage of gunners, but the cold precision of calculated devastation. Warfare had become an equation, and America had solved it. The story of time on target is ultimately the story of transformation. Artillery transformed from individual batteries firing at individual targets to integrated systems delivering massed effects. Soldiers transformed from warriors to technicians. Warfare transformed from art to science, and in that transformation, the nature of military power fundamentally changed. The shells that converged on Hill 401 that November morning carried more than explosive. They carried the weight of American industrial might, the power of systematic thinking, and the terrible efficiency of warfare reduced to mathematics. When they detonated simultaneously, they announced that the age of technological warfare had fully arrived. No amount of courage could stand against such systematic destruction. No defensive position could withstand such concentrated violence. No military tradition could compete with such mathematical precision. Time on target had made American artillery not just effective, but irresistible. The final accounting reveals the stark truth. During World War II, American artillery, primarily through time-on-target techniques, inflicted more casualties on German forces than any other weapon system. More than aircraft, more than tanks, more than infantry weapons. The mathematics of synchronized destruction had proven more lethal than any other aspect of combat. For the German and Japanese soldiers who faced it, time on target must have seemed like divine intervention, as if the universe itself had turned against them. They could understand an enemy who fought with guns and tanks. They could not understand an enemy who fought with slide rules and synchronization. But for American artillerymen like Staff Sergeant Hurley, time on target was simply the logical application of American approaches to any problem. Standardize the process, optimize the system, scale the solution. They had turned warfare into an industrial process, and like any industrial process, it could be managed, improved, and perfected. The shells that arrived simultaneously on target didn't just destroy enemy positions. They destroyed the very concept of traditional warfare, replacing it with something new, something terrible, something utterly American. The transformation of combat into coordinated calculation, where victory went not to the brave, but to those who could best solve the equations of modern war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.